The photograph had been hidden for years in the desk drawer, where Sophie wasn't allowed to play. But children are always the exception to their parents' many prohibitions. The little girl had found the photo, held it up, curious about the young woman with the radiant smile, and her father had taken it back without any explanation. That December night, when thick snow blanketed the world in silence, and his daughter begged him to stop the car, he never expected what would happen next. Sophie pressed her face against the cold window glass, eyes wide, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Daddy, that's her, the girl from the picture." Time stopped. Daniel's hands froze on the steering wheel as he looked at the woman trembling on the sidewalk, a small child clutching her thin coat. Older, thinner, broken in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, but unmistakable. Sarah, the girl who had vanished 15 years ago without a word, leaving him to search empty streets and unanswered questions. And now she stood there in the snow, a ghost turned flesh, while his 7-year-old daughter whispered desperately, "Help her, Daddy. Please." He didn't know that the woman he had mourned had survived something far worse than his loneliness. He didn't know that one snowy night could unearth everything he had tried to forget. Daniel Harper had built his life on routine. Every morning at 6, he was already in the kitchen making coffee, the kind with just enough cream to soften the bitterness, but not enough to make it sweet. By 6:30, he was waking Sophie with a gentle knock on her door, waiting for her sleepy voice before stepping inside. Breakfast was always simple: toast, scrambled eggs, orange juice in the blue cup she'd picked out herself at the grocery store 3 years ago. He never varied the pattern because patterns made Sophie feel safe, and making his daughter feel safe was the only thing that mattered after her mother had walked out when she was barely 3 years old. His ex-wife, Victoria, had married him for the wrong reasons: the penthouse overlooking the city, the black card with no limit, the social circles that came with being Mrs. Harper. She'd played the role well enough until Daniel started spending 18-hour days at the office, building the tech company that would eventually make him one of the youngest CEOs in the industry. Victoria had found comfort elsewhere, in the arms of a man who had more time and less ambition. The divorce had been swift and cold, a transaction handled by lawyers in mahogany offices. She'd taken the money and left Sophie behind without a second glance, as if their daughter was just another asset she didn't want to maintain. Daniel had never told Sophie the full truth. How could he explain to a child that her mother had chosen a life of leisure over her? Instead, he'd simply said that sometimes people need to go their separate ways, that it didn't mean anyone stopped loving anyone else. It was a lie, but it was a kind one. Sophie had stopped asking about her mother by the time she turned 5. Now, at 7, she seemed content with their life of 2. The house in the suburbs with the big backyard, the Friday movie nights with popcorn, the way her father always remembered to cut the crusts off her sandwiches, even though she'd told him 100 times she didn't mind them anymore. But there were things Daniel couldn't hide from himself, even if he could hide them from Sophie. The photograph in his desk drawer was one of them. He'd kept it all these years, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was proof that he'd once been capable of loving someone completely, before business and betrayal had taught him to keep his heart locked away. The girl in the photo, Sarah Bennett, had been 17 when they met, working at her father's bookstore near the college, where Daniel was finishing his business degree. She'd recommended books to him, classics he'd never heard of, contemporary novels that made him think differently about the world. They'd talked for hours between the dusty shelves, and somewhere between Fitzgerald and Hemingway, he'd fallen in love with the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about stories. They'd been together for 2 years, stealing moments between his classes and her shifts at the store. He'd planned to propose after graduation, had already picked out a modest ring he could barely afford on his part-time salary. But then everything had collapsed. Sarah's father had made bad investments, borrowed money from the wrong people, and when the debt collectors came knocking, the Bennett family had vanished in the middle of the night. Daniel had searched for months, driving to every town within 100 miles, calling every number he could find, but it was as if they'd been erased from existence. Eventually, he'd forced himself to stop looking. He'd thrown himself into building his career, into becoming the kind of man who couldn't be hurt by loss because he had too much control over everything else. That was 15 years ago. Daniel had convinced himself he'd moved on, that Sarah was just a memory from a younger, more naive version of himself. But the photograph stayed in the drawer, and sometimes, late at night when Sophie was asleep, he'd take it out and wonder what had happened to the girl with the radiant smile. He never expected to find out. Life didn't work that way. People who disappeared stayed, disappeared. Until they didn't. The evening had started ordinarily enough. Daniel had picked Sophie up from her ballet class, the one she attended every Tuesday and Thursday evening at the community center downtown. She'd chattered the whole way to the car about the recital they were preparing for, how she was going to be a snowflake in the winter performance, how Mrs. Patterson said she had natural grace. Daniel had listened with half his attention while mentally reviewing the quarterly reports he needed to finish before the board meeting on Friday. He was good at multitasking, at being present enough to satisfy his daughter, while his mind worked through the endless problems that came with running a company. The snow had started falling around 7, light at first, just a dusting that melted on the warm pavement. But by the time they left the community center at 8:30, it was coming down in thick, heavy flakes that stuck to everything. The streets were emptying fast, most people smart enough to get home before the roads became dangerous. Daniel drove carefully, his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead for black ice. Sophie sat in the back seat, humming the music from her ballet routine, her breath fogging the window as she traced patterns in the condensation. They were only a few blocks from home when Sophie suddenly pressed her face against the glass, her humming stopping mid-note. "Daddy, stop!" Her voice was urgent, almost panicked. Daniel's foot hit the brake instinctively, the car sliding slightly before coming to a halt. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" He twisted in his seat to look at her, checking for signs of injury or illness. But Sophie wasn't looking at him. She was staring out the window at something on the sidewalk. "Daddy, that's her, the girl from the picture." Sophie's finger pointed at a figure huddled against a brick wall, partially obscured by the falling snow. Daniel's heart lurched in his chest, a physical sensation so strong it almost hurt. He looked where she was pointing and saw her, a woman in a thin coat that was completely inadequate for the weather, her arms wrapped around a small child who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The woman's hair was longer than he remembered, darker somehow, and her face was gaunt in a way that spoke of hunger and hardship. But the shape of her features, the way she held herself even while shivering violently, was unmistakable. Sarah. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was seeing. His mind raced through possibilities, coincidence, mistaken identity, some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But Sophie's voice cut through his paralysis. "Help her, Daddy. Please." There was something in his daughter's tone, a desperate compassion that reminded him of why he'd had children in the first place, why he'd stayed in the marriage as long as he had, why he got up every morning and went through the motions even when everything felt heavy and meaningless. He put the car in park and stepped out into the snow, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. The woman didn't look up at first, just held the child tighter, as if preparing for violence or rejection. Daniel approached slowly, his expensive leather shoes crunching in the fresh snow, his cashmere coat suddenly feeling obscene in its warmth and quality. When he was a few feet away, he stopped, unsure of what to say. How to bridge the 15-year gap between who they'd been and who they were now. "Sarah?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with emotions he couldn't name. The woman's head snapped up, and for the first time, he saw her face clearly in the yellow glow of the streetlight. Her eyes were the same, that particular shade of hazel that had reminded him of autumn leaves. But everything else had changed. There were lines around her mouth that hadn't been there before, a tightness in her jaw that spoke of pain endured and survived. And in her eyes, there was a wariness that made his chest ache, a fear that said she'd learned not to trust kindness because it always came with conditions. Daniel. She said his name like a question and a statement at once, like she couldn't quite believe he was real. Her arms tightened around the child, who peered out at him with wide, frightened eyes. We were just... She stopped, unable to finish whatever excuse she'd been forming. What could she say? That she was fine? That this was a temporary situation? That she didn't need help from a ghost from her past? Daniel didn't wait for her to finish. He shrugged off his coat and held it out to her, ignoring her automatic movement to refuse. Take it. Please. When she hesitated, he added more softly, for your daughter. That did it. Sarah took the coat with trembling hands and wrapped it around the child, whose lips had a faint blue tinge that made Daniel's stomach clench. Sophie had gotten out of the car despite his earlier instruction to stay inside, and now she stood beside him, her small hand slipping into his as she looked up at the woman and child with solemn eyes. Are you really the lady from Daddy's picture? Sophie asked, her voice carrying the blunt curiosity of childhood. Sarah's eyes moved from Daniel to Sophie and back again, confusion, and something else, maybe pain, flickering across her face. He keeps it in his desk, Sophie continued, oblivious to the weight of what she was revealing. Sometimes I see him looking at it when he thinks I'm asleep. Daniel felt heat rise in his face despite the cold, but he didn't contradict his daughter. What was the point of denying it now? Instead, he focused on the practical, the immediate problem in front of him. My car is warm. Let me take you somewhere. A hotel, a shelter, anywhere you need to go. Sarah shook her head, the movement almost violent. We can't. I can't pay you back. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Daniel realized she was on the edge of breaking, holding herself together through sheer force of will. I'm not asking you to pay me back, Daniel said quietly. I'm asking you to get out of the snow before you and your daughter freeze. They stood there for a long moment, the snow falling between them like a curtain, before Sarah finally nodded. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Daniel guided them to his car, helping Sarah and the child into the back seat next to Sophie. His daughter immediately started chattering, introducing herself, asking the little girl her name in the fearless way of children who haven't yet learned about social barriers and awkward silences. Lily, the child whispered, her voice so quiet Daniel almost didn't hear it. Sarah pulled her daughter closer, and Daniel caught the protective gesture in the rearview mirror as he started the car. He didn't ask where they were going, because he already knew. There was only one place he could take them, only one option that made sense. His house had 4 bedrooms. 2 of them were empty. The drive home was silent except for Sophie's gentle attempts at conversation with Lily, who responded in monosyllables when she responded at all. Sarah stared out the window, her body rigid with tension, her hands never leaving her daughter. Daniel's mind raced with questions he couldn't ask, observations he couldn't voice. The way Sarah's wrists looked too thin, visible even through the borrowed coat. The way Lily's clothes were clean but worn, carefully mended but obviously old. The way neither of them had bags, not even a small purse or a child's backpack. Everything about them spoke of people who'd been running from something, or toward something, or maybe just trying to survive one day at a time. When they pulled into his driveway, Sarah made a small sound. Not quite a gasp, but close. The house was modest by CEO standards, a 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, a yard that Sophie used for cartwheels in the summer and snowmen in the winter. But Daniel saw it through Sarah's eyes now, saw the wealth it represented, the security, the distance between his world and whatever world she'd been inhabiting. "I can't," she said, her voice tight. "This is too much. You'll just what?" Daniel turned to face her, his voice sharper than he intended. "Go back out into the snow." "Sleep on the street?" "Sarah, I don't know what happened to you, and I'm not asking you to explain. But please, for one night, just accept help." Sophie had already gotten out of the car and was holding Lily's hand, leading her toward the front door, like they were old friends. Sarah watched them go, her expression unreadable, before finally meeting Daniel's eyes. "Just tonight," she said. "Then we'll leave in the morning." Daniel nodded, though they both knew it was a lie. Whatever brought her to that sidewalk, whatever she was running from, it wouldn't be solved by morning. But he let her keep her dignity, let her pretend this was temporary, just a brief pause, before she continued on to wherever she'd been heading. They got out of the car and walked to the door, and with each step, Daniel felt the weight of the past 15 years pressing down on him, all the questions he'd stopped asking, all the what-ifs he'd buried under work and routine. Sarah Bennett had come back into his life like a ghost made flesh, and nothing would ever be the same again. Inside, the house was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the cold darkness outside. Sophie had already taken Lily to the living room, where she was showing her the collection of stuffed animals that lived on the couch. Daniel watched Sarah take in her surroundings, the hardwood floors, the framed photos on the walls, the kitchen visible through an open doorway with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Her face remained carefully neutral, but her hands betrayed her, twisting together in a nervous gesture he remembered from years ago, when she used to get anxious about exams or worried about her father's mood. "I'll show you to the guest room," Daniel said, his voice softer now that they were out of the car, away from the immediate crisis. "There's a bathroom attached. You can take a shower if you want, and I'll find some clothes for you and Lily." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "They're Sophie's old things. They were just going to be donated anyway." It was a lie. Sophie had already donated most of her outgrown clothes, but it seemed to make Sarah feel better about accepting. He led them upstairs, acutely aware of Sarah walking behind him, of the sound of her breathing, of the faint scent of cold air, and something else, something that reminded him of rain-soaked streets and desperation. The guest room was at the end of the hall, decorated in neutral tones, with a queen bed and a reading chair by the window. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking at the room like it was a museum exhibit, something to be observed, but not touched. Lily pressed against her mother's legs, her small face peering out with the same wariness. "I'll get those clothes," Daniel said, retreating before the silence could become too heavy. He went to Sophie's room, where she was already pulling items from her dresser, her small face serious with concentration. "These might fit Lily," she said, holding up a pair of pajamas with stars on them. "And maybe this sweater for tomorrow?" She was trying so hard to help, to be grown up about this strange situation, that Daniel felt a surge of pride and sadness at once. His daughter had learned too young how to handle unexpected changes, how to adapt without complaint. "Those are perfect, sweetheart," he said, taking the clothes. "Why don't you get ready for bed? It's late." Sophie looked like she wanted to argue, to stay up and learn more about the mysterious woman and child who'd appeared in their lives, but she nodded. She was a good kid, better than he deserved. He kissed the top of her head and returned to the guest room, where Sarah was standing exactly where he'd left her, as if she'd been frozen in place. "Here," he said, holding out the bundle of clothes. Sophie wanted to make sure Lily had something comfortable to sleep in. Sarah took the clothes with hands that trembled slightly, her eyes fixed on the pajamas with their cheerful stars. "Thank you," she whispered. "For all of this. I can't." Her voice broke, and she pressed her lips together hard. Fighting for control. Daniel wanted to reach out, to comfort her somehow, but he didn't know if he had the right. 15 years was a long time. She wasn't the girl he'd known anymore, and he wasn't the boy who'd loved her. "The bathroom is through that door," he said instead, pointing. "There are clean towels in the cabinet. Take your time." He started to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Sarah?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm glad you're safe," he said simply. "Whatever else happens, I'm glad you're here." He didn't wait for a response, just closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall in the hallway, his heart pounding like he'd just run a marathon. Down the hall, he could hear Sophie brushing her teeth, humming the melody from her ballet class. The sounds of his normal life continued around him, but nothing felt normal anymore. Sarah was in his guest room. Sarah, who he'd searched for until the searching had nearly destroyed him. Sarah, who he'd finally forced himself to forget so he could move on with his life. And now she was back, with a daughter and a story he didn't know, and Daniel had no idea what came next. He pushed away from the wall and went to his own room, where he changed into sweatpants and an old college t-shirt. Through the walls, he could hear the sound of water running in the guest bathroom, and he tried not to think about Sarah standing under the shower, tried not to imagine what she looked like now, tried not to remember what she'd looked like then. Instead, he focused on practical matters. He'd need to make breakfast in the morning. Something simple that wouldn't overwhelm Lily. He'd need to figure out if they needed anything. Clothes, shoes, basic necessities. He'd need to be careful not to push, not to demand explanations, not to scare them away before he understood what had happened. But most of all, he needed to understand what he was feeling. The shock was wearing off, leaving behind something more complicated, a mixture of old pain and new concern, of questions that demanded answers, and a fear of what those answers might be. Sarah had left without a word 15 years ago. Now she'd appeared without warning, clearly in trouble, clearly running from something. And Daniel, who'd built his entire adult life on control and careful planning, found himself completely unprepared for the chaos of emotions she'd brought back with her. He was still awake an hour later when he heard a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Sarah standing there, wearing Sophie's old clothes that were slightly too big, her hair damp and hanging around her shoulders. She looked younger this way, more like the girl he remembered, but her eyes were older than they should be. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Just for a minute." Daniel nodded and stepped out into the hall, closing his door behind him. They stood there in the dim light, two people who'd once known each other completely, and now were strangers. "I need you to know," Sarah started, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I didn't plan this. Finding you. I didn't even know you were still in the city." She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture. "We were just trying to get somewhere warm. Anywhere warm." And then Sophie recognized me, and she stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I don't want you to think I was looking for you, or trying to take advantage. I don't think that," Daniel interrupted gently. "Sarah, I don't know what you've been through, but I know you well enough to know you wouldn't use anyone like that." Did he, though? Did he really know her at all anymore? But it seemed important to say it, to give her that reassurance. She looked at him with those haunted eyes, and he saw something crack in her carefully maintained composure. "Everything fell apart," she whispered. "After Dad lost everything and we had to leave, it just kept falling apart, and I kept trying to hold the pieces together. But there were too many pieces. and they kept cutting my hands. And she was rambling now. Words tumbling out without order or sense. I tried to find you once, years ago, but you were married, and you looked happy. And I thought, I didn't want to ruin anything for you. You deserved better than someone like me, someone with all this damage. Stop. Daniel's voice was firmer than he intended, and Sarah flinched. He softened his tone. Just stop. You don't have to explain everything tonight. You're exhausted, and whatever you've been through, it can wait until morning. He wanted to ask about Lily's father, about where they'd been living, about why she looked like she hadn't had a decent meal in months, but he forced himself to be patient. Go to sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Sarah nodded, relief visible on her face. She turned to go back to the guest room, then stopped. Daniel? He looked at her. This ghost from his past made real. Thank you, she said simply, for not turning away. Then she was gone, the guest room door closing softly behind her, and Daniel was alone in the hallway once again. He went back to his room but didn't sleep, just lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around him. Somewhere down the hall, Sarah was sleeping under his roof. Somewhere in the city, snow continued to fall, covering everything in white, making the whole world look clean and new. But Daniel knew better. The snow would melt, morning would come, and with it, the truth about what had happened to Sarah Bennett, about where she'd been for 15 years, about what had broken her so thoroughly that she'd ended up shivering on a sidewalk with a child in her arms. He wasn't sure he was ready for that truth. But ready or not, it was coming. The morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of winter day that made staying in bed feel like the only reasonable option. But Daniel was already up by 6, habit stronger than exhaustion. He'd slept maybe 3 hours total, his mind too full of questions and memories to properly rest. He made coffee in the quiet kitchen, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, while snow continued to fall outside the window. The street was empty, pristine white except for the tire tracks from his car last night. Everything looked peaceful, deceptively simple. He was scrambling eggs when he heard small footsteps on the stairs. He turned to find Lily standing in the kitchen doorway, wearing the star pajamas Sophie had picked out, her dark hair tangled around her face. She stared at him with enormous eyes. And Daniel realized with a start that the child was probably terrified. Strange house, strange man, everything unfamiliar. Good morning, he said gently, crouching down to her level. You must be hungry. Do you like eggs? Lily didn't answer, just watched him with that unnerving stillness. Sophie appeared next, already dressed for the day even though it was Saturday, and she had nowhere to go. Hi, Lily, she said brightly, completely unaware of or unconcerned by the younger girl's silence. Do you want to see my room? I have a dollhouse. She took Lily's hand without waiting for an answer and started to pull her toward the stairs, but Lily resisted, looking back toward the guest room. It's okay, Sophie said. Your mom is still sleeping. My dad makes really good pancakes. Well, kinda good. Sometimes they're a little burned. She grinned at Daniel, who couldn't help but smile back. Traitor, he said mildly. I make excellent pancakes. The tiny smile that flickered across Lily's face was gone so fast, he almost thought he'd imagined it. But Sophie caught it too. See, she thinks it's funny. Come on, Lily. This time, the little girl allowed herself to be led to the living room, where Daniel could hear Sophie chattering about her stuffed animals, her ballet class, her favorite cartoon. He finished making breakfast, setting the table for 4, though he had no idea if Sarah would come down. She did, 20 minutes later, when he was plating the eggs and toast. She paused in the kitchen doorway, wearing the same borrowed clothes from last night, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked better after sleep. less like a ghost and more like a person. But there was still that wariness in her eyes, that tension in her shoulders. "I hope you're hungry," Daniel said, deliberately keeping his tone light. "Sophie always insists I make enough food for an army." "You didn't have to," Sarah started, but he cut her off. "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to." He gestured to the table. "Please sit." She did, moving carefully, like someone who wasn't used to being in comfortable spaces. Lily came running at the smell of food, Sophie right behind her, and they all sat down to eat. It was strange, this impromptu breakfast, like playing house with pieces that didn't quite fit together. But Sophie chatted enough for everyone, filling the silences with stories about school and friends and the upcoming ballet recital. Lily slowly began to relax. The smell of warm food and Sophie's endless enthusiasm breaking through her shell. She ate like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal might come, and Daniel had to force himself not to react, not to show the anger he felt at whatever circumstances had led to a child being that hungry. Sarah barely touched her food, pushing eggs around her plate while watching Lily with fierce attention. Only when her daughter was nearly finished did Sarah finally start eating, and Daniel realized with a sick feeling that she'd been waiting to make sure Lily had enough first. After breakfast, Sophie convinced Lily to play in her room, and Daniel and Sarah were left alone with the dirty dishes and the weight of everything unsaid. Sarah stood and started gathering plates, but Daniel stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Leave them," he said. "Let's talk." She went still, then nodded, following him to the living room where they sat on opposite ends of the couch, a careful distance between them. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, leaving everything buried under several inches of white. "I need to tell you," Sarah began, her voice steady but quiet, "about what happened, about why I disappeared." Daniel wanted to say she didn't have to, that they could just exist in this moment without dragging up the past, but he knew that wasn't true. The past was here with them, sitting between them like a third person. "My father," she continued, "had borrowed money from some very bad people. When he couldn't pay, they came to collect. We had to leave in the middle of the night, just took what we could carry and ran. We ended up in Ohio, living in a motel. And Dad he wasn't the same after that. He started drinking. A lot." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "I got a job at a diner, tried to keep us afloat, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. And then Dad died, liver failure, and I was 18, and completely alone. I tried to come back, to find you, but by the time I saved enough money for a bus ticket, you were—" Her voice cracked. "You were married. I saw you with her, your wife, at some restaurant downtown. You looked so happy. And I thought, I couldn't interfere with that. You'd moved on. You deserved to move on." Daniel felt like he'd been punched. "Sarah, But she held up a hand, needing to finish. "I stayed in Ohio, got another job, then another. I was doing okay for a while, and then I met Lily's father." The way she said it, bitter and flat, told Daniel everything he needed to know before she continued. He seemed nice at first, charming, said all the right things. But after Lily was born, everything changed. He wanted a son. An heir, he called it, like we were living in some medieval kingdom. When Lily turned out to be a girl, She stopped, her breathing ragged, and Daniel saw her hands trembling. "He hurt us," she said finally, the words coming out like broken glass. "Not at first. At first it was just words, making me feel small and worthless. But then it got worse. He said I'd failed him, that I owed him for taking care of us, that I wasn't allowed to leave. I tried a few times, but he always found us. He had money, connections, and I had nothing." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't stop. 3 weeks ago, I finally got away. Took Lily and just ran. We've been moving ever since, sleeping in shelters when we could, anywhere we could find, when we couldn't. And last night? Daniel's voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. We'd been walking all day. The shelter was full. We were just trying to find somewhere out of the wind when Sophie saw me. She finally looked at him, really looked at him, and her face was raw with pain and shame and exhaustion. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you got dragged into this. We'll leave today. I just need to figure out where to go next and... No. The word came out harder than Daniel intended, and Sarah flinched. He gentled his voice. You're not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow. Not until you're actually safe. She was shaking her head before he finished. You don't understand. If he finds us here, if he comes after you because of me, then we'll deal with it, Daniel interrupted. Sarah, I have resources. Lawyers, security, whatever you need. You don't have to run anymore. I can't pay you back, she started, but he cut her off. I don't want you to pay me back. I want... He stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. What did he want? To help her, yes. To keep her safe, absolutely. But there was more, something deeper and more complicated that he wasn't ready to examine. I want you and Lily to stay until you figure out your next steps, however long that takes. They sat in silence for a long moment, the sound of Sophie and Lily playing upstairs filtering down to them. Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? After everything? After I disappeared without a word? Why would you help me? Daniel looked at her, this woman who'd once been a girl he'd loved, who'd somehow survived things he couldn't imagine, who was still fighting, despite everything trying to break her. Because 15 years ago, you were the best thing in my life, he said simply. And even though that was a long time ago, even though we're different people now, I couldn't live with myself if I turned you away. The words hung between them, honest and raw. Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And this time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He moved closer and pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him like a puppet with cut strings. He held her while she cried, feeling the sharp angles of her shoulders through the borrowed clothes, smelling the faint scent of his own shampoo in her hair. He held her and thought about all the years between them, all the pain and loss and broken promises, and wondered if it was possible to find your way back to someone after so much time had passed. Eventually, Sarah's sobs quieted to hiccups, then to shaky breaths. She pulled away, embarrassed, wiping at her face. I'm sorry, she said again. But Daniel shook his head. Don't apologize. Not for that. Not for any of this. He stood and went to the kitchen, returning with a glass of water that she accepted with trembling hands. They sat in more comfortable silence now. The worst of it said. The truth laid bare between them. Upstairs, they could hear Sophie teaching Lily some clapping game, the rhythm off but enthusiastic. She's a good kid, Sarah said, looking toward the ceiling. Your daughter. You've done well with her. Daniel felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. Her mother left when she was 3. Haven't heard from her since the divorce was finalized. So, it's been just the two of us for a while now. He saw understanding flash in Sarah's eyes, a recognition of shared experience. They'd both been abandoned in different ways, both learned to be parents to daughters without partners, both built lives from the wreckage of what should have been. What was her name? Sarah asked. Victoria. We married for the wrong reasons. I don't know what I thought. That I could build something stable, maybe. That if I focused on the business and the future, the past wouldn't matter. But it turned out she was only interested in what I could buy her, not who I actually was. When I started working longer hours, She found someone who could give her more attention. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out we both chose poorly. Did you love her? The question was soft, almost hesitant. Daniel considered it honestly. No, he finally said. I liked her. I thought I could grow to love her. But love, that didn't happen. I think part of me was still. He stopped, realizing what he'd almost admitted. But Sarah was looking at him with those knowing eyes, and she finished the sentence for him. Still looking for what you lost. They didn't need to say anything more. The understanding passed between them, years of questions answered in that moment of quiet recognition. They'd both been broken by their separation. Both tried to move forward while carrying the weight of what might have been. And now, through some twist of fate or fortune, they'd been given a second chance to, what? Be friends? Something more? Daniel didn't know. He just knew that Sarah, sitting on his couch, felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. The rest of the day passed in a strange sort of domestic harmony. Sophie and Lily became fast friends, the way children do, while Daniel and Sarah figured out the logistics of having unexpected house guests. He called his lawyer friend, Mark, who specialized in family law, and arranged a meeting for Monday to discuss protective orders and custody issues. He went through Sophie's closet for more clothes that might fit Lily, then drove to the store to buy some basics: toothbrushes, underwear, socks, things Sarah would need if she was going to stay more than a night. When he returned, he found Sarah in the kitchen, making sandwiches for lunch, moving around his space with a careful familiarity. She'd found the bread, the peanut butter, the plates. She was trying to help, to contribute, to not be a burden. He watched her for a moment from the doorway, saw the way she cut the crusts off Lily's sandwich without asking, the way she wrapped it in a napkin just so. Small gestures of love and care that spoke of years spent being a mother under impossible circumstances. That evening, they ate dinner together again. Pasta this time, nothing fancy but warm and filling. The girls chattered through the meal, and Sarah slowly began to participate in the conversation, her shoulders gradually relaxing, her smile coming more easily. After dinner, Daniel built a fire in the living room fireplace, and they all sat around it. The girls playing quietly while the adults sipped coffee and watched the flames. It felt like a family, Daniel realized. It felt like something he'd been missing without knowing it. Later, after the girls were asleep, Daniel and Sarah sat in the dim living room. The fire burned down to embers. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, and this will have been a dream, Sarah said quietly. That I'll be back on that sidewalk, and none of this will be real. Daniel looked at her, illuminated by the soft glow of the dying fire. It's real, he said. You're safe here. Both of you. For how long? She asked. And there was something in her voice. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. As long as you need, Daniel answered. As long as you want. They looked at each other across the small distance between them. And Daniel felt something shift in his chest, some peace falling into place that had been missing for years. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if they could truly find their way back to each other after everything that had happened. But sitting there in his living room, with Sarah safe and warm and real beside him, he thought maybe they could try. The fire crackled one last time and went dark, leaving them in comfortable silence. Outside, new snow had started to fall, gentle and quiet, covering the tracks from yesterday, making everything new again. And for the first time in 15 years, Daniel Harper felt like maybe, just maybe, he could stop looking back at what he'd lost and start looking forward to what he might find. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Sarah and Lily stayed in the guest room. though Lily spent most of her time in Sophie's room, the two girls becoming inseparable. Sarah helped around the house, cooking meals and doing laundry, despite Daniel's protests that she didn't need to earn her keep. But he understood that she needed to contribute, needed to feel like she wasn't just taking charity. So he let her help, and slowly, the house began to feel less like his space, and more like their space. Monday came with its appointment with Mark, the lawyer. Daniel took Sarah into the city, while Sophie stayed home with Lily, watching movies and eating popcorn. In Mark's office, with its leather chairs and mahogany desk, Sarah told her story again, about Lily's father, about the abuse, about running. Mark listened carefully, taking notes, his expression growing darker as Sarah spoke. When she finished, he looked at her with something like admiration. "You're incredibly brave," he said, "and we're going to make sure you stay safe." He explained the options, restraining orders, custody proceedings, the legal framework that could protect them. Sarah listened intently, asking questions, her intelligence evident despite her lack of formal education. Daniel watched her and felt pride mixing with anger at the years she'd spent just trying to survive when she should have been thriving. When the meeting ended, Mark shook both their hands and promised to start the paperwork immediately. "He won't be able to touch you or Lily," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." On the drive home, Sarah was quiet, processing everything. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you for coming with me. For everything." Daniel glanced at her, saw the vulnerability in her face. "You don't have to keep thanking me," he said gently. He paused, unsure what to call what they were. Friends didn't seem adequate, former lovers too distant. "We're in this together now." Something in Sarah's expression softened, and she nodded. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they arrived home, they found the girls in the living room, surrounded by art supplies. "We made you pictures," Sophie announced, holding up a drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. "That's us, our family." Sarah froze, her eyes on the drawing. Daniel saw the conflict on her face, the desire for this to be true, warring with the fear that it couldn't be. That night, after the girls were asleep, Daniel found Sarah standing at the window in the guest room, looking out at the snow-covered yard. He knocked softly on the doorframe, and she turned, giving him a small smile. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just thinking. About Sophie's drawing. About how she sees us as a family." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't want her to get hurt when we leave, when Lily and I find our own place." "Is that what you want?" Daniel asked quietly. "To leave?" Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw the truth in her eyes before she spoke it. "I don't know what I want anymore. For so long, I just wanted to survive. I never let myself want anything more than that." She turned back to the window. "But being here, with you, watching Lily be happy for the first time in years, it's dangerous." "Why dangerous?" Daniel moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Because it makes me hope," Sarah said softly, "and hope has only ever hurt me before." Daniel understood that, the fear of wanting something too much, of letting yourself believe in possibilities. But he also understood that some things were worth the risk. "Maybe it's time to try hoping again," he said. "Maybe we both deserve that." Sarah turned to face him, and they were standing so close he could see the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, could count the freckles across her nose that he'd once memorized. "Daniel," she whispered, and his name on her lips was a question and an answer, and 1,000 things in between. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, like someone starved for gentleness. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said quietly. "We don't have to know what happens next week or next month. But right now, in this moment, you're safe. Lily's safe. And maybe that's enough for today." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "When did you become so wise?" she asked. "Sometime between the divorce and learning to braid Sophie's hair," he said, and she laughed, the sound surprising and genuine and beautiful. They stood there for a long moment, not quite touching, but not quite separate, existing in that space between what was and what might be. Finally, Daniel stepped back, knowing that pushing too fast would only scare her away. "Good night, Sarah," he said softly. "Good night, Daniel," she replied, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Warmth, maybe, or trust, or the fragile beginning of healing. The weeks passed, and slowly, gradually, Sarah began to believe she might actually be safe. The legal proceedings moved forward. Lily's father was served with a restraining order, and Mark was building a case for full custody that looked increasingly solid. Sarah got a part-time job at a local bookstore, a deliberate choice that made Daniel smile, remembering where they'd first met. She started to fill out, the hollows in her cheeks softening, her movements becoming less skittish. Lily bloomed like a flower finally getting sun, her silence giving way to giggles and chatter, her fear transforming into the normal energy of a 4-year-old child. Sophie and Lily were officially best friends now, and Daniel had to admit he loved seeing his daughter so happy. She'd been an only child for so long, and having Lily around brought out a nurturing side in her that was beautiful to watch. The two girls did everything together, played, ate, watched movies, even shared a bedroom more often than not because they didn't want to be apart. And Daniel and Sarah, they were finding their way back to each other, step by careful step. There were quiet conversations over coffee in the mornings before the girls woke up. There were moments when their hands would brush, reaching for the same dish, when their eyes would meet across the room and something wordless would pass between them. They were learning each other again, discovering who they'd become in the 15 years apart, finding that despite everything, some essential connection remained. One evening in late February, Daniel came home from work to find Sarah in the kitchen, making dinner. Flour dusting her cheek, Lily and Sophie giggling at something as they set the table. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly normal, that it stopped him in his tracks. This, he realized, was what he'd been missing. Not just Sarah, though he'd certainly missed her, but this sense of completeness, of being part of something larger than himself, of having a reason to come home that wasn't just responsibility, but genuine desire. Sarah looked up and caught him staring, a question in her eyes. "What?" she asked, self-consciously touching her face. Daniel crossed the kitchen and gently wiped the flour from her cheek with his thumb. "Nothing," he said softly. "Everything." She held his gaze, and he saw her understanding, saw her feeling the same thing he felt. The girls had gone quiet, watching them with interest. "Are you guys gonna kiss?" Sophie asked with the blunt curiosity of a 7-year-old. Sarah's face went red, and Daniel laughed. "Sophie," he said, but his daughter just grinned. "Well, Miss Sarah is really nice, and she makes good cookies, and Lily could be my sister for real if you got married." "Sophie," both adults said together this time, and the little girl just laughed, running off with Lily to escape the embarrassment she'd caused. Daniel and Sarah looked at each other, still standing close, and Sarah started laughing. "She's not subtle," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "She's definitely my daughter that way." They smiled at each other, and the moment stretched between them, full of possibility. "Daniel," Sarah said quietly, "I need you to know something." He waited, giving her space to find the words. "When I left 15 years ago, When I thought I lost you forever, I never stopped loving you. I tried. God knows I tried. But you were always there, in the back of my mind, the standard I measured everything against. Daniel's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay still, to let her finish. And now, being here, seeing the man you've become, the father you are, I'm falling in love with you all over again. And it terrifies me because I don't know if I deserve this, if I deserve you, if... He stopped her with a finger against her lips, gentle but firm. Sarah, listen to me. You deserve everything good this world has to offer. You deserve safety, and happiness, and love. And if you'll let me, I want to give you all of that. I'm still broken, she whispered. So am I, he said. We both are, in different ways. But maybe broken people can help each other heal. Maybe that's the whole point. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. I love you. I loved you 15 years ago, and I love you now. And if you give me the chance, I'll love you for the next 15 years and beyond. Sarah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she was kissing him, and he was kissing her back, and 15 years of loss and longing and loneliness poured into that kiss. It was gentle and desperate, familiar and new, a promise and a question all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Sarah was smiling through her tears. I love you too, she said. I never stopped. From the doorway, they heard squealing and giggling. Sophie and Lily were watching them, dancing around in excitement. I told you, Sophie said triumphantly to Lily. I told you they liked each other. The girls ran over, wrapping their arms around both adults' legs, and Daniel looked down at this makeshift family they'd created. His daughter, Sarah's daughter, Sarah herself, and felt something in his chest expand with a happiness so complete it was almost painful. That night, after the girls were asleep, Daniel and Sarah sat together on the couch, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They talked about the future now, about what came next. Sarah would keep her job at the bookstore, would save money, would eventually be able to contribute financially, though Daniel insisted he didn't care about that. They'd have to have conversations with the girls about what their relationship meant, about what changes might be coming. They'd have to take things slowly for Lily's sake, make sure she felt secure and safe through all the transitions. What if he comes looking? Sarah asked quietly, the fear still there, even though Mark had assured them the legal protections were solid. Then we deal with it, Daniel said firmly. Together. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. You're never going to be alone again. She tilted her head up to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become, both beautiful, both strong in different ways. Thank you, she said, for that night in the snow, for stopping the car, for not driving past. Daniel thought about that moment, about how close he'd come to telling Sophie they couldn't stop, that they needed to get home. About how different everything would be if he'd made that choice. I think Sophie knew, he said. Somehow, she knew it was important. Sarah smiled. She's a special kid. Takes after her father, Daniel said with mock arrogance, and Sarah laughed, swatting his chest playfully. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled in the fireplace, snow falling gently outside the windows. Daniel thought about the photograph in his desk drawer, the one he'd looked at for 15 years, wondering what had happened to the girl with the radiant smile. He didn't need to wonder anymore. She was here, in his arms, real and alive, and his again. The journey hadn't been easy, for either of them, but maybe that was what made this moment so precious. They'd both survived their own kinds of winters, their own kinds of darkness. And now, together, they could finally step into the light. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked softly. Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That sometimes the best things in life are the ones you thought you'd lost forever. That second chances are real. That my daughter is wiser than I gave her credit for." He paused. "And that I'm the luckiest man alive because you walked back into my life." Sarah lifted her head and kissed him, soft and sweet. "We're both lucky," she said. "Against all odds, we found each other again." And it was true. Against all odds, through 15 years of separation and pain and survival, they'd found their way back to each other. The road ahead wouldn't be perfect. There would be challenges, legal battles to finish, trauma to heal from, 2 daughters to raise and blend into a family. But they would face it together. No longer alone, no longer broken in the ways they'd been before. Sophie had been right that night in the snow. Daniel hadn't known what that snowy night would bring when he stopped the car, when he looked at the woman shivering on the sidewalk and recognized the ghost of his past. He hadn't known it would change everything, would give him back something he thought he'd lost forever, would transform his quiet life into something fuller and richer and more meaningful. But now he knew. Now they both knew. And as they sat together in the warm house while snow fell outside, Daniel Harper held Sarah Bennett close and thought about how strange and wonderful life could be, how the worst moments could lead to the best ones, how sometimes you had to lose everything to understand what truly mattered. The photograph in his desk drawer could stay there now, a relic of the past. He didn't need it anymore. The woman in the picture was here, in his arms, and she was so much more than a memory. She was his present, his future, his second chance at everything he'd thought he'd lost. And this time, he would make sure she knew every single day that she was loved, that she was safe, that she would never have to face the cold alone again.